Hey guys, today we're going to be starting our biology unit, which is one of the smaller units that we're going to be doing. This unit, we focus on kind of cells generally at first, but then we really get into just plant biology. So most of this unit is going to be focusing on plants. Today we're going to be just reviewing cells, which most of it should be stuff that you've learned before in elementary school. Okay, so this is your introduction to cells. The cell was first discovered in 1665, and it was named and discovered by Robert Hooke. Now, just so you know, you do need to know the names of these different people. You do not need to know the dates that they made their discoveries and stuff like that. Robert Brown was the first one to identify the nucleus of a cell. Matthias Jakob Schleiden was the first one to say that all plants are made up of cells and that the nucleus was responsible for the development of those plant cells. And then Theodor Schwann came a little while later and pretty much said the exact same thing, but for animal cells. Before the microscope existed, people believed in something called spontaneous generation, which is this idea that living things could just spontaneously come from non-living things. That is now completely disproven, but that was very widely accepted in its time. Rudolf Virchow was the first person to say that cells can only come from pre-existing cells, not from non-living things. Once we started getting better technologies and microscopes and that sort of thing, the cell theory was developed. And the cell theory has three parts. It says that all living things are made up of at least one cell, that cells are the structural and functional unit of life. Another way of saying that is that cells are the building blocks of all living things. And the third is that all cells come from pre-existing cells through the process of cell division. So that is the part of the cell theory that kind of goes against the spontaneous generation theory that came previously. Okay, these are the characteristics of all living things. In order to be classified as a living thing, that thing must meet all of these criteria. If it just meets most but not all, then it's not living. So all living things are made of cells. They have different levels of organization, and what we mean by that is that you have cells, and then those cells form tissues, and those tissues form organs, and those organs form organ systems. So those are kind of different levels of organization. All living things use energy, whether that be energy that you get from eating something or energy that you get from the sun. If you're a plant, all living things need energy. All living things respond and adapt to their environment. So if it gets cold, you shiver. If it gets warm, you sweat. With plants, we're going to learn later, but they have tropic responses where they can move based on things like their position relative to gravity and the sun and that kind of thing. All living things grow and repair. So if you get a cut, that cut repairs itself, and obviously we all grow. All living things reproduce, whether that is sexually or asexually. All living things produce and excrete waste. That's not just like urine and feces, that also includes like for animals breathing out carbon dioxide, for plants breathing out oxygen. All living things require nutrients, whether you get it from the soil or something you eat. All living things move, even if it is just within cells. So obviously not all living things get up and walk around, but at the cellular level, there are things moving around inside of cells in all living things. All living things need water. All living things exchange gases. So like for animals, breathing in oxygen, breathing out carbon dioxide. For plants, the opposite of that. And all living things metabolize, which just means that all living things have chemical reactions that take place inside of our cells. So this is what a plant cell would look like. Obviously, this could look different. This is just kind of a generic plant cell. You do need to recognize most of these structures. The only one you don't need to be able to recognize is a microbody. But we've got the nucleus, which is this circly bit at the top here. Around the outside of that, you have the endoplasmic reticulum. You don't need to differentiate between the smooth and the rough endoplasmic reticulum. You just have to know it's kind of wrapped around the nucleus. Then over here, we have the Golgi bodies. You have the chloroplast on either side right here. You have the mitochondria, which has this kind of squiggle back and forth inside of it. There's another one up here. And then this very large shape right here is the vacuole. And then obviously around the outside, you have the cell membrane, which is this kind of orange barrier. And then the thick green barrier on the very outside is the cell wall. Animal cells obviously look slightly different. Kind of the biggest distinction is that there is no cell wall on the outside here, just a cell membrane. These shapes, these blue ones, you can recognize as the mitochondria because of this back and forth squiggle. That's kind of how you always recognize mitochondria. Big circles are lysosomes, which you will only see in animal cells, not plant cells. Again, we have the nucleus, the big circly thing. You don't need to know the nucleolus, which is inside. You just have to know the whole nucleus. And then again, like I said, wrapped around the outside of the nucleus is the endoplasmic reticulum. And then you also have the Golgi bodies here, which you can usually recognize because they have these little parts that are like circles that kind of hang off the outside of the Golgi bodies. Those are the vesicles. Okay, so we're going to just kind of go through each of those parts one at a time and some of the things that you need to know about them. So the cell membrane is also called the plasma membrane. We are going to learn a lot more about this in the next lesson, but it is a protective barrier for the cell. It allows certain materials to be moved into and out of the cell. It also allows for cells to communicate and interact with one another, as well as to recognize different molecules. The cell wall is a much sturdier structure found only in plants. And the reason plants need that sturdy structure is because plants don't have a skeleton. So the only way to get like a tall tree that doesn't just like flop over on itself is to have this nice rigid cell wall that can stack on top of each other. It is made of cellulose and it helps provide strength and shape to the entire plant. Then we have the nucleus, which is where the genetic material of the cell is. So in humans, DNA, in some other organisms, it would be RNA, but it's always where the genetic material is. It also directs all cell activities, so it's kind of the coordinator of everything that's happening in the cell. It is surrounded by a nuclear membrane, which has pores that allow certain things to move into or out of the nucleus. Chloroplast is found only in plants. It's where the chlorophyll is, which is what is responsible for photosynthesis. So chloroplast is the site of photosynthesis. That's why it's only in plants. You can recognize it in like a diagram because it has these little stacks of pancakes inside of it. And we'll talk more about the structure of that later. But yeah. The cytoplasm is the gel-like substance that kind of suspends all of the organelles inside of the cell. It also contains nutrients that are required for different cell processes to happen. So lots of things get transported through the cytoplasm to different areas in the cell. Then you have lysosomes, which are those little circular sacs. They are found in animal cells and they contain really strong digestive enzymes. Their purpose is to sometimes break down foods, other times digest infectious microorganisms or old parts of the cell, and they can also cause apoptosis, which is cell death. That usually happens if the cell is infected or if it has had a mutation that can be cancerous, stuff like that. What'll happen is the cell will detect that it's infected or something like that, and it will burst its lysosomes and digest itself from the inside out, essentially killing itself. Because of that, lysosomes are sometimes referred to as suicide sacs. By the way, this is what happens if you get like a sunburn. So if you've ever had a sunburn, which most of you probably have, essentially what happens is that those cells in the area where you were burned have become damaged by the UV radiation you've exposed them to. And because of that, the DNA has mutated, it is potentially cancerous, and so to try and protect you from actually developing cancer, those cells will just kill themselves so that they aren't a danger to you. So they will rupture their lysosomes, the cells will die, and that is why it becomes like really red and sore, because you have a bunch of cells dying in there. If enough of them die off, it'll like bubble and peel and stuff like that. Great. Okay, then we have ribosomes. Ribosomes are super tiny little dots that are floating around. They're also on the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and that is where protein synthesis happens, or where proteins are made. The endoplasmic reticulum, again, it kind of wraps around the outside of the nucleus. The rough endoplasmic reticulum is where the ribosomes are, so helps with proteins being made. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum doesn't have any ribosomes, but it helps make fats. Again, you don't have to differentiate between the two different types of endoplasmic reticulum, as long as you know that it helps with protein and fat synthesis. You should also know that it helps with the transport of both of those proteins. Essentially, it acts like a giant conveyor belt, moving those fats and proteins kind of away from the nucleus towards the rest of the cell. Then you have the Golgi bodies, also called the Golgi apparatus. Again, it's this kind of wiggly structure, but it's most recognizable because it has these little circles usually floating just off of it. The Golgi bodies packages proteins and lipids, usually that are coming from the endoplasmic reticulum, and it essentially packages them up into little vesicles, which are just little circles of membrane. So the Golgi bodies is kind of like the shipping warehouse that everything's getting packaged in, and then the vesicles are the actual like FedEx vans or whatever that drive away and carry the things that they're transporting. The vacuoles, actually let's go down to vesicles first. The vesicles transport the materials either into or out of the cell, so they will leave the Golgi bodies and usually go to the cell membrane and actually move whatever they're carrying out of the cell, and we'll talk about how they do that later. You can also have vesicles that are coming from the cell membrane into the cell. Vacuoles are very large inside of plant cells. They're much larger in plant cells than in animal cells. They do exist in both. They store nutrients, waste, and most importantly, water. In plants, that really large vacuole is super important because it can fill with water, and as the vacuole fills with water, it kind of swells and it puts pressure, like kind of pushing outward on the cell wall. That results in something we call turgor pressure, which is essentially just like a water pressure that makes the entire cell nice and rigid. Without that, the plant becomes really like limp, and that's when you see like, you know, a plant kind of tipping over, or if you've ever like had celery in your fridge that's like not crisp anymore, it's just kind of like limp and wobbly. That's because its vacuoles don't have enough water in them. When the vacuoles are full, it's nice and rigid and crunchy. Like I said, animal cells also have vacuoles for storage, but we don't need that like turgor pressure to keep us upright because we do have skeletons. So our vacuoles are much smaller and less important. Then we have the mitochondria, which again you recognize because it has this kind of back and forth wiggle thing happening. They are the site of cellular respiration, which essentially means that it is where chemical energy from food is converted into a usable form of energy, which is called ATP. All cells have mitochondria in them. However, cells that require more energy tend to have more of these. So cells like muscle cells that need a lot of energy to allow you to move, sperm cells that need a lot of energy so they can swim, they're going to have more mitochondria than, say, like a skin cell. Okay, and that is it for today's lesson. I hope there was something new in there for you to learn.